I didn't want to die, and I didn't see much chance of living, but I was gradually getting frozen up. Probably dream of that tonight. You lie in bed at night and the whole thing comes round again.
All the people who were standing at the railing jumped. They jumped and they screamed and they yelled, and I can still hear them.
Oh, hundreds and hundreds, you see, and they joined together, man. They kind of kept away from the railing, but they were standing together, you expect, and they joined hands, man, and they are hollered in different languages, save us, save us, save us. That is a picture I can never forget as long as I live.
Hello, all of my history-loving friends. This is Madame Morbid. I'm your guide on any number of historical adventures. Today, we are going to learn about the Titanic disaster as we listen to the voices of the people who were there. I would imagine anybody watching this knows about the Titanic disaster, but to make YouTube happy, I do need to give an introduction. If you want to skip this part, I'm going to put the timestamp on the screen right now. Titanic was one of 3 sister ships commissioned by the White Star Line. There were various shipping companies at this time. Cunard was one of their biggest competitors. The ships were built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland. The first of these ships was the Olympic. Titanic was in the middle, and the third sister was Britannic. World War I got in the way, so Britannic never saw service as a passenger liner. We can't even imagine the craftsmanship. These were actual artists who were creating these lush interiors. And when this ship went down, those people lost a part of themselves. That was their work. That was their pride. So in April of 1912, Harland and Wolff had finally finished her. She had her sea trials right there in Belfast. Her crew joined her there, and they brought her to Southampton, England, to pick up passengers and finish out the crew. As you can imagine, Southampton was absolutely devastated because so much of the crew came from that city. Sailing day was April 10th. Captain Edward J. Smith was the captain. He had worked for White Star Line for years and years and years, and he was one of their top captains. And nothing he did that night really was unusual. The night of April 14th at 11:40, lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee rang the bell and notified the bridge where First Officer William Murdoch was on duty. By the time the iceberg was seen, there really was no way to avoid hitting it. And there have been people debate if they just rammed it head on, it might have survived, but that's not going to be your instinct. Your first instinct is going to be, I have to avoid hitting this. First Officer William Murdoch was in charge of loading the lifeboats on the starboard side of the vessel, while Second Officer Charles Lightoller was loading boats on the port side, which were the even-numbered boats. Murdoch's boats were the odd-numbered. These 2 officers differed wildly. For Charles Lightoller, it was women and children only. For Murdoch, it's whoever's standing there. You're there, I got room, get in. Most of the men owe their lives to Murdoch and the other officers working on the starboard side of the ship. She had 20 lifeboats, 16 were regular lifeboats, and then there were collapsible boats that literally you could mash them flat. They had canvas sides, and you kind of popped up the sides, and they did not have time to launch those. They launched 2 of them, but there were 2 still on board when the final plunge came. Titanic went down at 2:20 in the morning, and ultimately what killed most everybody was they froze to death. It wasn't drowning. It was 30-degree water. You could not withstand it for very long. I was 4 years old when Robert Ballard found the wreck of Titanic in 1985. And at first my interest was in the ship itself. I'd never seen something so beautiful. And seeing the wreck and what was left of that beautiful vessel was so fascinating to me. But as I've grown older, I've become interested more in the people. Every person interviewed is listed by the name they had at the time of the sinking. So women that later got married, I refer to their maiden name as it was in 1912. I also include little blurbs, additional information. Think of it as footnotes in a book with interesting background information. Feel free to read it or not. And when we get to the sinking itself, you're going to start hearing the Morse code softly in the background. As they are telling you their stories, this is going on in the wireless room, and the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, are screaming for help. That is playing at 1.5 times the actual speed, simply to get it to coalesce with the timeline of the video. I want to give a shout out to Titanic Honor and Glory. Since 2012, they have been meticulously recreating the Titanic digitally. The attention to detail, it's amazing. You can walk the decks of Titanic again, as close as you're going to get anyway. I also want to thank Encyclopedia Titanica. It was a fabulous resource for looking up the people that are mentioned by our survivors. Titanic Archive had all of these interviews. They are available in their entirety on YouTube. As a historian, one of the sources I used in my research most frequently is news coverage, usually newspapers, sometimes television broadcasts. And as is true with every source, I have to be cognizant of biases. I have to be aware that sometimes what I'm reading might not be accurate. The media coverage of Titanic is actually a very unique situation. Carpathia made sure that nothing was getting out. Journalists didn't know what had happened, how many were saved, anybody, did it sink, did it not sink? And so what we find is media outlets were literally guessing, hoping that they guessed right. Look at this headline here. Oh, that's just embarrassing. And this outlet here, they rolled the dice and got it pretty good. But either way you look at it, they're making it up. So we have to be really careful when it comes to news sources and where we're getting it. The author of the source I'm using might have an agenda. Maybe they want to protect their reputation, so they exaggerate their role or downplay their role in an event. I had to train myself to really think critically about every source I use, and it is a learned skill. We as news consumers need to think critically about where we're getting our news also. And that's why I'm honored today to introduce you to my very first affiliate partner, Ground News, that hopes to help the average consumer do just that. Ground News is a website and an app that makes it easy to compare news articles from around the world. It helps readers spot media bias through analysis and direct comparison. It's not fact-checking individual articles. Neutral third parties have examined each news outlet. They've determined how accurate they tend to be in their overall coverage, make note of their general biases, where they lie on the political spectrum, and ownership. Is it independent media, or do they answer to corporate overlords, or a gazillionaire with an agenda? All of this data is compiled so that the news consumer can make well-informed decisions about where they get their news. Okay, so since we're talking about a ship sinking today, let's see if there are any sinking ships going on right now. We don't have any ships, but we do have some boats sinking off Greece and Turkey, costing the lives of more than a dozen migrants. In terms of bias, the left is covering it, but the right, it really isn't covering it much at all. It's got 17%. Then the center's covering it okay. You have a breakdown here of all of the different outlets covering this story. Ones that lean left, and then ones that lean to the right, and of course the center right down the middle. So it looks like 93% factuality on this particular story. That's good. You can see all the different headlines. The main difference I see here is not so much bias as just the headlines differ in terms of as the story is emerging. So the death toll is different in some of the headlines. And then it's interesting, go up here to the blind spot, and you can see all the stories that one side or the other isn't covering. And this story comes up actually on the right. That's always a good one to get out of your comfort zone, see what the other side is talking about. Are there things going on that are being withheld from you because for partisan reasons. Ground News is just a great way to train yourself to think more like a historian when you are reading news stories. Everybody's got an agenda, and there is a way to train ourselves to recognize it, to question what we read. And Ground News has done most of the work for you. Click on the link in the description to get 40% off their Vantage plan. That's $5 a month for all of the features from the premium plan. Join Ground News today. Become a more savvy news consumer and help the channel in the process.
I joined her in Belfast while she was still in the builder's hands, the biggest and finest ship in the world. We ran our trials in Belfast Lough and then took her round to Southampton.
That day finally came, and I was very, very excited about coming to America for several reasons, of course. One of them was that we were going to visit two other countries that I had never been, France, and then over to Ireland, and then we were going to take off and head for New York.
We decided to sell up everything and go to America and open a hotel in Seattle. I stood there and I looked at that great big place. She's very high. And I thought, my word, it was a floating palace.
She was the last word in luxury. All her public rooms were absolutely amazing. All the woodwork was beautifully carved, and she had everything. She was a beautiful ship.
It was nice even in the steerage. There was a place, you see, where there were small tables you could sit and play cards. Or they had a room for the ladies. There was a piano in there they'd sit and sing or play. And there was a bar that you could go up to the bar, order whatever you want, to beer, whiskey, wine, whatever you wanted. I said to one fellow I'd give $5 if he'd be allowed to go through it. I said, and see the first class of it. But even third class was good.
But we were sleeping six in a bunk, and we were treated like as if we were in a third-class restaurant as regards the food. We were not allowed to go in any part of the ship except the deck that we were allowed to go on.
I do remember it being very beautiful and very big. My little brother was 2 years old, and to pass the time away, I would wheel him up and down the deck. I looked in a great big window into the beautiful dining room, and the silver and the linens, everything was beautiful and new. I just stood there and marveled.
There was something about the Titanic. It was so very formal. It was so stiff. Well, you know, the kind of get-together feeling, it didn't exist.
Officials on board, we had Bruce Ismay aboard, we had the designer aboard, and we had 12 millionaires aboard, and their wives.
And so she met my father, married him, and they were divinely happy. He was so good to her. And I was born, which added to her joy. She had a lovely home. My father had a motor car, which in those days was rather remarkable. And everything was wonderful until this night. And the moment this arrangement had been made to go to Canada, my mother had this dreadful premonition. She'd never had one before, and she never had one after. But she said, no, we can't do this. It's quite wrong. Something dreadful will happen. And I tell you what the sort of woman she was. She'd got both feet on the ground, and for her to behave like that was absolutely unbelievable to everyone. But she just had that premonition. And my father said, oh, nonsense. And of course the time went by and the house was sold and we were ready to go, and we went down to the ship. But she said to him, now, I don't want any more unhappiness about this, but my mind is made up, and I will not go to bed in this ship. I shall sleep in the daytime, and I shall sit up at night. And I so well remember what he said to her. He said, if you want to be so stupid, I can't stop you. She said, I know, but I'm going to do it. And she did.
I bought my ticket to be on another boat, but they cancelled her sailing, and I could be transferred, so I got transferred to the Titanic. And some of my friends were rather doubtful about it, but I didn't feel that way. So when I got on there, a woman said to me, you know, she said, this boat would never reach New York. Well, I said, don't be saying things like that. Well, she said, I can't help it, but it'll never reach New York. But she's my roommate.
The night before sailing, the night of Tuesday, April the 9th, I spent in a hotel in Southampton. As I sat the following morning in the breakfast room, from the windows of which could be seen the 4 huge funnels of the Titanic towering over the roofs of the various shipping offices opposite, there sat behind me 3 of the Titanic's passengers discussing the coming voyage and estimating, among other things, the probabilities of an accident at sea to the ship. As I rose from breakfast, I glanced at the group and recognized them later on board. But they were not among the number who answered to the roll call on the Carpathia on the following Monday morning.
My mother had to see the purser, and she said, you know, I am not one bit happy about going on this ship to New York City. And he said, why? And she said, because this is the first trip it's ever made. And she says, I'm just a little nervous about it. And he says, Madam, you don't have to be afraid of anything. He says, you know that the Titanic has watertight compartments. And if anything does happen, these watertight compartments will keep the ship up until they get help.
Lifeboats were a thing that they weren't necessary. You see, we were on a ship that was unsinkable. We had no lifeboat drills, and the list of lifeboats, I believe, was put up in the galley about the day that we struck an iceberg. Nobody knew where their boats were.
When they got through, they got 2 tugboats to try and get the bow from the dock, you see, away from the dock so that they could go out. Well, it was so big and heavy that it was hard for them to move this ship, you see. And then they started at one of the propellers, you see, to try and help along. And the suction of it in there was so strong that it broke the towing line of the steamship New York. And we come awful close to having a collision before we ever got out of it. And there was one woman, I heard it myself. She said, the ship is never going to see New York.
My father had a very bad dream before we left, but he would never tell my mother what it was. It looked as if the New York was going to run into the Titanic, and my father turned around and said, that's a bad omen.
Mail, and from there we went to Queenstown and picked up mail, specie, mail and passengers. And then we went flat out for New York. Speed about 22, 23, 24 knots. Well, everybody was set to enjoy themselves. And after the third day, we had messages coming in about ice and icebergs, but we didn't seem to take much notice of that. We went flat out.
He ran around the ship with a group of young people about his own age. They did a lot of exploratory stuff. They viewed down into the engine room to watch the stokers and the firemen do their thing, and they did that from Scotland Road, which is a passageway that ran the length of the ship, mostly used by crewmen to go back and forth between the fore and aft portion of the ship. The kids of my grandfather would run around through the ship, and they did all kinds of things. Some things weren't so good. For instance, they were playing follow the leader. They were going to try and go hand over hand on the cables. They found out that these were full of grease, so my grandfather was the only one that did this. And I'm not so sure my great grandmother was very happy with them when he came in with black hand.
I saw a little dog that was travelling without its master in care of the crew, a dear little dog. My father managed to get round one of the sailors to let us go aft where this little dog was. There were a lot of dogs on board, and I loved that little dog dearly. And it was drowned, poor little thing. And I always wanted one like that, but I didn't get one for many years, but I did eventually. And I remember a lot about playing on the deck with that little dog. I remember the dining saloon very well, which was very nice. I remember the playroom, I suppose it was a playroom, where I played quite a lot with other children. And the decks where my father walked with me, of course, the second-class decks. But it isn't blurred at all, but it's all shadowed by what happened eventually.
We had a very wonderful cabin. It had 2 bunks and a couch in it, and the couch was turned into a bed at night, and I had the couch for my bed. They had many card parties and get people acquainted. We had deck quoits, and they did all they could to make her happy. A very happy girl, very happy.
That night, or it was on a Sunday, you see. Well, in the morning, a lot of them, they didn't get up so early, but then they had breakfast, and then after a while, then they had the church meeting, you see, on there.
And he said, did you hear that singing and that sermon? Oh, he said, it was so wonderful. He said, it was out of this world. And said, in fact, I think we're too happy to last long. So I thought, well, there goes another.
And my mother then said, well, surely if there's ice in abundance in the sea, there could be icebergs. And this officer who was on table, he said, oh, nonsense, this is an iceberg. This enormous thing, we should see an iceberg. You've nothing to be afraid of. And that was on the Sunday morning. And for the first time, since we had gone on board the ship, she didn't get up from breakfast and go straight to bed, which was what she normally did, because it was Sunday and she thought she'd like to go to church, which she did. And then we had lunch together before she went to bed. And I remember that meal so well because that was the last meal that the 3 of us ever had together.
After, I don't know, probably about 2:30 and so on, you see, when they started and they had a big party, I stayed up till about 10 o'clock that night and listened to them. I didn't dance or anything, but...
I was in my cabin then. We had a cabin for 6, and we were discussing what we'd do when we arrived back in Southampton. All of a sudden she came to a halt. There was no impact as such. It was just like jamming your brakes on a car.
Yeah, this here Humlin, he woke up too when we struck the iceberg. Well, it wasn't the jar of it or anything of that sort, no. We could hear someone talking in the hall. And this here fellow, he says, what is that? Well, I said, I don't know, but I said, I'll sure get up and find out. And I looked at my watch. It was 10 minutes to 12.
And my mother sat down to sew and read, and she said at 10 minutes to 12, she felt a slight bump. She said it was just like a train pulling into a station. It just jerked.
When they struck the bells, I was sitting in my cabin having a cup of tea, and immediately got up and walked along to the bridge, about 60 feet away on the same deck. I was about halfway between the officers' quarters, the entrance to the officers' quarters and the bridge, when the crash came, and it didn't break my step.
There was a very slight bump, just a little jar, nothing at all. And I went in my room. There was a second light jar, nothing of consequence. But you knew something had happened.
And I had made a date with the gentleman to take a cup of coffee with him that night. And I called out to him at a nearby stateroom and I said, come on, see what the bumps are. And I slipped on a coat over my white satin evening dress. My stateroom had a door leading to the promenade deck. And as I got out on the promenade deck, I saw a large grey, well, it looked to me like a building floating by. Great big grey thing. But that building kept bumping along the rail, and as it bumped, it sliced off bits of ice, and ice fell all over the
the deck. And one man said, "Look at that. That's an iceberg. And it's a whopper. Because you know, there's 1/8 above the water and 7/8 below. And this blooming thing's all the way over the top of the ship." Thought nothing of it. We picked up the bits of ice, and most of us prayed snowballs.
I was lying in my bunk when I felt the slight jar, not any sense of collision, but more a kind of shiver that ran through the ship. It was enough to bring me out of my bunk in one jump. Out on deck, I ran over one side and then to the other, but there wasn't a trace of anything we'd struck. So back I went to my bunk and just waited.
At 20 minutes to 12, I was pacing up and down the deck, and I felt a good jar. I thought that was peculiar. I looked along the side, and I saw what I thought was a windjammer. But as it came astern, I saw it was an iceberg.
But in a few moments, I felt the engines slow and stop. The dancing motion and the vibration ceased suddenly, after being part of our very existence for 4 days. And that was the first hint that anything out of the ordinary had happened. I jumped out of bed and slipped on a dressing gown over my pyjamas, put on shoes and went out of my cabin into the hall near the saloon. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, opened the vestibule door to the top deck, and stepped out into an atmosphere that cut me like a knife. Walking to the starboard side, I peered over and saw the sea some 70 feet below, calm and black. No iceberg on either side or astern as far as we could see in the darkness. There were 2 or 3 men on deck, and with one, the Scottish engineer, I compared notes. Through the windows of the smoking room we saw a game of cards going on, and went in to inquire if they knew more than we did. But none of them had gone on deck to make any inquiries, even though one of them had seen an iceberg go by, towering above us. He'd called the others' attention to it, and they all watched it disappear astern, but then at once resumed the game. I expect the iceberg has scratched off some of her new paint, and the captain doesn't like to go on until she's painted up again, said one. We laughed, and one of the players, pointing at the glass of whisky standing at his elbow, said, "Just run along the deck and see if any ice has come aboard. I'd like some for this."
Evening came, and Frankie was put to bed, which was usually around 8:30. And the next thing I knew, I wakened. Mother was putting my clothes on, finished dressing myself, and started to put my shoes on. I had one on, and then I was down on my knee, lacing the strings of my second shoe, when a man came in. He was an officer of the ship, up at the ceiling, and he said, "You have life preservers up there. You'd better put one on because you may have to go out in a lifeboat." Sorry to say this, it made me very, very excited because we young kids had not been permitted to get into these lifeboats, and we had tried several times.
It was very slight, but she said she knew that it was this dreadful something, and she wakened my father. She wakened me, and my father said no, he wasn't going up on deck again after the night before. But she literally pulled him out of bed and made him go up. And she then said she was going to dress me, and I, being sleepy and very naughty, said I wasn't going to be dressed. Nothing to be dressed for. I'm going back to bed. My father came back very quickly because he could get up to the boat deck in the lift very quickly from where our cabin was. He came back and he picked me up and wrapped his blanket tightly around me as if I were a baby. And my mother said nothing to him, and I used to say to her sometimes, years afterwards, "I can't understand why you didn't say to him, what was it?" And she said, "I didn't have to say, what was it? I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was this dreadful something that I had to live with." So he put his very thick coat on her and put another on himself. And without any words at all, we went out of the cabin and into the lift and up onto the boat deck.
My mother went out in the hall and asked the first cabin steward she saw, "What is the matter? Why have we stopped in the middle of the ocean?" And so he said, "No, there's nothing wrong at all. There's just had a little accident, and they're going to fix it, and we'll be going on in a few minutes.
Well, I told him, I said, no, I said, I'll go upstairs. I said, I want to find out. So I went up the 3 stairs up to the main deck on the front part there, you see what was going on. And there was a few of the sailors there, and I asked them, what is wrong? Oh, they said, there's nothing. He said, just go down again. They said, there's nothing. But I saw this ice, you know.
I came out of my cabin and I thought, oh, I'd go forward. And I went forward to the well deck on the starboard side, and I could see ice in the well deck. There's no sign of iceberg then, because she'd passed us. And the lights were shining on the water from the portholes. There's no sign of damage above waterline.
And I heard him say to Murdoch, what's the matter? What have you stuck? He said, we've stuck an iceberg, sir. He said, I'm going full speed astern, sir, on the port engine. He swung her head round towards port, and she was on the swing. And that's why she was torn underneath. She was penetrated in 6 compartments. Well, whilst the captain was talking to Murdoch at the starboard wing of the bridge, I slipped down to go forward and have a look to see if I could find any damage. Nobody told me to go. I went forward to the entrance to the 3rd class, and I went down below as low as I could go without removing any hatches or anything. I went down to the 3rd class, crossed over to the starboard side, and I walked along there and looked in the cross passages. I couldn't hear any noise. I couldn't see any damage. As I was emerging on the deck, some of these men were on their way back again to their beds. There was one man had a piece of ice, and I took it away out of his hands, wondering where he got it from. Tried to make him understand that it was nothing, there was nothing the matter. Go down and go to bed and go to sleep again, you see. Walked along the upper deck on the starboard side to see where the ice came from. And there, just inside of the ship's rail, there was a powdering of ice running along. I came up onto the bridge again and reported to the captain, I've been down below, sir, and I don't see any signs of any damage, not even a glass port broken. He said, did you see the carpenter anywhere, Mr. Boxhall? I said, no, sir, I didn't. He said, I do wish you would go down and find him and tell him to sound the ship round for and let me know right away. Well, I didn't get down all the ladders down to the foredeck. I met the carpenter coming up, absolutely out of breath, and he said, Mr. Boxhall, he said, the forepeak hatch is blown off and number 1 tarpaulin is ballooning up. He said, she's evidently making water fast. So I said, all right, go along, carpenter. The captain is on the starboard wing of the bridge, and tell the captain. I didn't get down to the foredeck because I met a mail clerk coming up. And he said, Mr. Boxhall, the mail room's filling. So I said, oh, carry on, and you'll find the captain on the starboard wing of the bridge and report to him. I said, I'll go down there and have a look. So I continued on my way down to the mailroom. I tried to go into the 1st class entrance from that lower deck, from the foredeck. But they'd got the watertight door closed. I had to come up all these ladders and go up over the promenade deck and then down through the main saloon entrance, where I found the band was beginning to tune up. And I got my way down to the mailroom, and I got down as far as the sorting room. And all the mail clerks were there pulling letters out of the racks. And I was standing on the top of a companionway from the sorting room down to the handing room. And I saw a bag floating by. I instinctively stooped down to try and pick it up. I just couldn't reach it. I realized then that it was serious.
Andrews and Bruce Ismay and the captain were together discussing this, and Bruce said to Andrews, how are things down below? And Andrews said, she's going to sink, sir.
It wasn't long before Boxhall, the 4th officer, poked his head round my door and said, you know we've struck an iceberg. I know you've struck something, I told him. Then he said, the water's up to F deck in the mailroom. There was no need for him to say anything more. I was into a pair of pants, sweater, and breech coat and out on deck almost as soon as he was. Now we've been running under a big head of steam, and the sudden stopping of the engines lifted every safety valve. And as a result, the steam roared off all exhaust. The row was absolutely deafening. Shout as loud as you like. No one could hear a word.
There was so much noise upstairs. They were running upstairs and running in the halls and yelling and all that. We had the two kids with us and we dressed them. And we didn't dress ourselves, so we put our coats over our night clothes. We did not put on any life belts. We didn't take time for that.
Because, I said, she was about 20 miles ahead of our position. Amended this position and took it on to the wireless room. And Phillips, the wireless operator, was bending over his instrument, the telephone, holding the telephone. He says, I'm in contact with the Carpathia. Well, I put the amended position down on the desk, and I said, now send that amended position. Do you understand? He said, yes. Well, I said, send that off right away.
Now, we were told we were only going to leave because it was rules and regulations. No danger whatsoever. We'd all be back for breakfast. And I thought it was perfectly asinine to leave a warm, comfortable ship to come back for breakfast. It's ridiculous. So I went to bed. A little while later, a man came to my door. His teeth were chattering. He said, "Madam, get up, get out. Do you know, they're making the women and children leave in lifeboats." So I got out of bed. I only had one woolen dress that was out. A sheath dress, a half a yard around the ankles, so tight that from my hips to my ankles I was practically, well, I would say I was in a potato sack. I couldn't walk. I had a hobble. In those days they were called hobble skirts. And I put on a wool cap and a couple of foxes. I remember a white fox and a brown fox or something. And the thinnest fur coat I had, a broadtail, which I might as well have put a tissue paper on, and lovely velvet slippers with diamond buckles. And no underwear, and no stockings. I couldn't have been dressed more ridiculously. Now I had promised my mother never to leave my little mascot. I thought nothing of danger, and the little mascot was left on my dressing table. But I did do something that was clearly idiotic. I locked every window in my 3 staterooms and closed every trunk and locked every trunk. I locked the bureau drawers and the cupboards and took the keys with me. 19 keys for 19 trunks. And then went forward on the same deck to the drawing room, A deck, and sat down comfortably in a big easy chair.
So I went down again, and I went down to the room of my brother-in-law and my cousin. They had a room together. And I said, you better get up. I said, I guess there's something wrong. I don't know if there's any danger of it or not. Well, my cousin said, I like to sleep. No, I said, you get up. Then we went up together there up on deck. Well, by this time, you see, in the stairways, and some of them took it as a joke. They were laughing and all that, and some was crying, and some commotion, you see, how there's all this here going on. We come up then, we didn't know exactly what was going on, but I tried to get upstairs, but they locked the door, you see.
As soon as I had laced my shoe, I jumped up and rushed over to the sink in our cabin. And on one corner of it was a bottle of Eno's fruit salts. And on the other side was a bag of Gibson's fruit tablets.
And Mother, of course, had made me a drink of Eno's fruit salts, and I'd fallen in love with it because it tasted like ginger beer. Ginger ale, we called it in the United States. So I jammed those things into my pocket, and then shortly after that, Dad walked in, began to pack a little suitcase with things, and Mother had put a life preserver on me and had one on herself and had laid one on one of the beds for Dad. Mother told Dad to put this on, and but he didn't. When he had this suitcase all packed, he walked to the door to walk out, and Mother called to him and said, Fluff, which was his nickname because he had long curly hair. His name was Frank. If you don't put the life preserver on, I won't go with you. So he came back in. My dad took his overcoat off, put the life preserver on, and then put his overcoat on over the life preserver. Then we began to walk out through our cabin door, and waiting outside was Mr. Tom Theobald and Alfred Rush, there were actually 5 in our party. This friend of my father's had heard about America and thought he'd come over to find out if it was as good as he had been told it was. The 5 of us slowly walked forward out of the third-class section through a gateway to a stairway which led up to the second-class salon. Then we were asked to come through a gateway out onto the promenade deck, but Dad would have to leave the suitcase there because no people with suitcases were permitted to walk through. Laid it down, and we all walked out onto the promenade deck and then walked slowly towards the rear and then out onto the open deck.
I got hold of the bosun's mate and sort of showed him with my hands that I wanted him to start the men stripping off the boat covers. Just a little while before they were ready to swing out, I happened to meet the captain, and I asked him, by cupping my hands over his ear and yelling at the top of my voice, "Shall I get the women and children away, sir?" He just nodded, so I started to fill the first boat.
We all stood there quietly looking on at the work of the crew as they manned the lifeboats. All this time people were pouring up from the stairs and adding to the crowd. I was now on the starboard side of the top boat deck, the time about 12:20. We watched the crew at work on the lifeboats numbers 9, 11, 13 and 15. As we watched, the cranks were turned and the davits swung outwards until the boats hung clear of the edge of the deck. Just then, an officer came along from the first-class deck and shouted above the noise of escaping steam, "All women and children get down to the deck below, and all men stand back from the boats." 2 women at first refused to leave their husbands, but partly by persuasion and partly by force, they were separated from them and sent down to the next deck.
Just about now, thank goodness, the roar of escaping steam stopped, and passengers, now they could hear themselves think, started asking me, "Why are you getting the boats out? And why are you putting women and children in them?" I told them it was merely a precaution, and that very likely they'd all be taken on board again at daylight, or at the worst, taken on board the ship everyone could clearly see, only a few miles away.
I went back and told the captain, "There's a steamer in sight, very nearly ahead, but slightly on the starboard bow, and if she continues on her course, she'll pass close to us down the port side." I asked the captain, "Shall I send up some distress rockets, sir?"
And heard nothing or seen nothing till I saw a lifeboat being lowered on the starboard side. I reported into the bridge. I asked them if they knew there was a boat being lowered. They said they did and wanted to know who I was. I said I was the after quartermaster. They asked me if I knew where the distress rockets were. I said yes. They said bring them on the bridge. When Captain Smith saw me bring them up, he told me to fire one and fire one every 5 or 6 minutes. After about 2 or 3 minutes, he said to me, "Can you Morse?" I said, "Yes, a bit." He said, "Call that light up, Tell her where the Titanic's sinking. Please get all your boats ready. She never answered.
I think that by this time the work on the lifeboats and the separation of men and women impressed on us slowly the presence of imminent danger. But yet it made no difference in the attitude of the crowd. But if there were anyone who had not by now realized that the ship was in danger, all doubts on this point was dispatched in a dramatic manner. A sudden rush of light from the forward deck and a hissing roar made us all turn and watch as a rocket leapt upwards to where the stars blinked above us. Up it went, higher and higher, and then an explosion that seemed to have split the silent night in two. And a shower of stars sank slowly down and went out one by one. And presently another, and then a third. Anybody knows what rockets at sea mean.
We also called up this ship as she drew closer with a very powerful Morse lamp that we had. And eventually this steamer approached and approached until you could see all her lights with a naked eye. And I should say that she must have been within 5 miles off. You could not only see her lights with a naked eye, but you could see the lights in her portholes.
As I sat there, Wareham, my steward, came along, and I said, Wareham, here's my trunk keys and my stateroom keys. I understand we're being taken off the ship, and maybe you're going to be towed to Newfoundland, and maybe I won't come back in time. So here's my trunk keys. When you get to Newfoundland, go to the customs and send my trunks down to New York, will you? He said, you go on in, kiss your trunks goodbye. I said, do you think there's danger? Well, he said, I've got 5 children at home. I'm a bit worried. I believe I'd kiss my trunks goodbye. Oh, I said, for goodness sakes, go back and get my pig. It's on the dressing table. And I handed him the key to my stateroom. And he came back with the pig. And my fellow passengers looked at me in utter disgust. So I had my little pig, and I felt safe.
These boats, and my father helped. He knew a lot about the sea. And he put me in the lifeboat and told me to be good. He said to me, hold Mummy's hand, and I thought he was coming after me, but he didn't. Then it dawned on me, of course, that he wasn't coming, that I couldn't see him anymore. And we rowed away from the ship as fast as we could, because one has to do that, because I believe the suction when a vessel goes down is absolutely enormous. And I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink.
And I had orders to go down the storeroom with a gang of men and get all the biscuits we could find and bring them up to the boats and distribute around the boats. Well, when we got back up onto the boat deck, we couldn't get near the lifeboats. There were 3 boats up there that were full of passengers and a mixture of crew, I suppose. And we couldn't get them down because she had sort of list of port. You can imagine halfway down she'd have hit the ship's side. Some people were scrambling to get in, being pushed back. By that time she was listing very badly. Before I got my life belt on, I met a young couple. That was Mrs. Clark. They'd spent their honeymoon in France and we'd picked them up at Cherbourg. She was having trouble with her lifebelt. So I fixed that on to her, and I said, I think you'd better get into a lifeboat. And there was one in the port, on the port side. So she said, no, I don't want to go there. I don't want to leave my husband. So I said, well, it's just a precautionary measure. You get in, your husband will follow later on. And I got her away, and that was that. And then I picked up my own lifebelt and put it on. It was so sad to have to take the wives away from their husbands and leave the husbands up on deck. And I knew that she was sinking then. And I knew what chances we were just waiting for death.
We went up the steps and came to this great big room, and it was full of women, and in all kinds of dress and undress. They were crying or they were scared because they didn't know what was going to happen. We were there for about 5 minutes. 2 officers came in and they said, well, it's time to get into the lifeboats now. So one officer took my brother, the other one took my sister, carried them, and my mother and I climbed an iron ladder to the top deck to get into the lifeboat.
I made up my mind I wasn't going to leave the ship, and absolutely disinterested in anything pertaining to saving my life, because after all it was an unsinkable ship, you see. Moreover, I had my little pig. Nothing could happen to me. So I walked along the rail, and I found a gentleman standing at the rail. Strangely enough, the very gentleman that I had told on the tender that I was frightened to take the Titanic. And he said to me, hello, come on, you're going to get off of this ship. And I said, not me. How do you expect me to get off of anything with this thing I've got on? I can't even walk, much less get up to that rail and then jump. Well, I looked at that lifeboat, swinging out on the davits, possibly, I don't know by measurements, but it was an awful long way. And down below was the sea, 14 stories below. What if you jumped and you fell between? No. Well, he says, you'll have to. And as I stood there arguing with him, and I had my little pig, mind you, under my arm, a sailor came along. He said, yeah, now you can do as you want, but I'm going to save your baby. And he grabbed the pig, threw it into the lifeboat. They threw that pig. I knew it was my mother calling me. So I turned around to Mr. Monk and I said, that settles it. Here I go. Thought I was insane. Nobody knew what the pig meant to me. So he made a cradle of his hands with another gentleman. I sat on his hands, put my arms around his neck, and he threw me. And I fell in the bottom of the boat and kept looking and looking for my pig. I found him with his broken, poor little legs broken, and his nose gone. Well, made me feel very badly, but I kind of turned him. I found he was still playing music, so that was all right.
They took us to boat number 11. The officers put my little brother and sister in. They said, that's all for this boat. And my mother just yelled, screamed. She says, please let me in that boat. She says, those are my children. And so they did. They let her in the boat.
I was in bed sound asleep when they came and called all passengers, put on your life preservers, go up on boat deck. So I said I'd better put on a war coat, and I went back and put on a war coat. And I looked on deck, I looked and most of the boats had gone. I was so surprised. The captain was there and he said, stand back, and the men said, women and children only. And there was a man there with a baby in his arms, and he said, well, I don't want to be saved, but who'll save this baby? No one offered, so I said, well, I will. So you're foolish to save a baby. So I thought, well, I always do foolish things. So the lifeboat was there, it was lifeboat 13. The stewardess jumped in the lifeboat first. Then they tossed the baby into her arms, and they said, will you go in it? Yes. So I looked, there was the ocean, there was a lifeboat. I thought, oh, I'll never make it. But I jumped, and I got in there, and I hurt my ankles, but anyhow, I made it.
The sailors standing by the pulley ropes let them slip through the cleats in jerks, and down the boats went until level with B-deck. Women and children climbed over the rail into the boats, and then they were lowered one by one, beginning with number 9 and working aft towards number 15.
Well, I was left on the Titanic, so I went down and saw an officer putting people in the next boat, and I asked him if I could get in the boat, and he said sure, and he picked me up and dumped me in. I evidently was the last one put in that boat because they started lowering right away.
I saw a bandsman, a cellist, come round the corner of the vestibule and run down the now deserted starboard deck, his cello trailing behind him. This must have been about 12:40 a.m., and I suppose the band must have started playing soon after this. Many brave things were done that night, but none more brave than by those few men playing minute after minute, as the ship settled quietly, lower and lower in the sea, and the sea rose higher and higher to where they stood. The music they played served as their own immortal requiem.
Well, there's no question about the fact that they played. They were playing when we left the deck, of course they were. They didn't play all the evening, I suppose. And there's no question about the fact that after we were down on the water and they were playing, they played one version of the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee, of which there are three. I had this out so many times. And the one they played was the one that was played in church some months after, when I was with my grandmother, and I was so frightened I came out of church. I ran out. I knew the tune so well. But we were down on the ocean by then.
Almost immediately after this, I heard a cry from below, "Any more ladies?" I looked over the side and saw boat 13 swinging level with B-deck. The boat was almost full and about to be lowered. "No!" "Well, then you'd better jump." I sat on the edge of the deck with my feet over, threw my dressing gown into the boat, and dropped into the boat near the stern. There appeared to be no feelings of fear or apprehension as we jerked down foot by foot. Rather, it was a great adventure, and certainly on my part, no doubts about reaching the water safely. It certainly was thrilling to see the black hull of the ship on one side and the sea 70 feet below on the other, and to pass down by cabins and saloons brilliantly lighted. As we touched the water, the boat was carried along parallel to the ship and directly under the place where boat 15 would drop. She was on her way down, and we shouted to the crew to stop lowering, but they appeared not to hear. Then, mercifully, another stoker sprang with his knife to the ropes and quickly cut them through, and we were washed clear of the Titanic and floated away as the oars were got out.
Promenade deck, and then walk slowly towards the rear, and then out onto the open deck and up a stairway to the next deck and over to a gateway, and there an officer was stationed, and he was permitting only the women and children through. And I saw Dad and Mother come together, throw their arms around each other and kiss. Then I saw Mr. Theobald take his wedding ring off his finger and give it to Mother and say, "If I don't see you in New York, will you see that my wife gets this?" And so then Mother and I were permitted through this gateway, and Mother looked around quickly for Alfred, and he was standing back there with where Dad and Mr. Theobald were, and the officer had his hand on his arm trying to jerk him through the gateway. And what did young Alfie say? "No, I'm staying here with the men." And that's the way it was in those days, fellows. When you became 16, you didn't want to be classed as a kid. He didn't know this, of course, but he was going to die also.
We rowed away from her, praying that she would sink no further, and that we would find her at daybreak to be still there just as she was. But a stoker on board our boat was under no such illusion. He'd been at work in the stokehole. Suddenly, the whole side of the compartment came in, and the water rushed him off his feet. He sprang for the compartment doorway and just scrambled through the aperture as the watertight door came down behind him like a guillotine. In the intense heat below, he'd been working in thin trousers and singlet, and now his teeth were chattering with cold. He lay down under the tiller and fell into unconsciousness with another stoker's coat thrown over him.
The captain came across the bridge and said, "Mr. Boxhall, you go away in that boat. pointing to the port emergency boat number 2. He said, hurry up, Mr. Wilde is waiting to lower it. So I said, you see that white light over there? So pointing it out to him, he said, yes. I said, that is the stern light of that ship. I tumbled into this boat. They'd started to lower her. I found that I only had 3 of the ship's crew, a steward, a cook, and a sailor.
As time went on, I could see the bows of the ship getting steadily lower and lower in the water. Now, between lowering one boat and another, I frequently took a run forward and a quick look down a long stairway that led from the boat deck 3 or 4 decks down. Frankly, I'm never likely to forget the sight of that cold, greenish water creeping step by step up that stairway. Some of the lights were shining down on the water, and others, already submerged, were giving it a sort of ghastly transparency. I could tell by that staircase measurement how far down she'd gone and how quickly she was going. It was plain to me that if we were going to avoid the unutterable disgrace of going down with boats still hanging at the davits, we'd got not only to take chances, but we got to work like blazing.
All the lights were burning. You could see that her stern was getting pretty low in the water. She was certainly going down, there was no doubt about it then. And, we got away clear of the ship, and we just laid on the oars.
There was a light in the distance. The captain said, now men, row to that light, empty your boats and come back and pick up more passengers. So our men rowed and rowed, but we never could make that light.
Mother and I finally got up onto the top deck, slowly walked forward on the port side, right behind the last of the 4 funnels. And so we slowly walked forward, and then we'd have to stop every once in a while. And then we'd move forward again, and then again. And finally we got all the way to the very, very first funnel. And we came to a little column-way which was formed by a group of men, sailors and men passengers who had their arms locked together, and they were letting the women and children in and letting them go towards this boat. Mother and I were being led towards lifeboat Collapsible D. It was the last lifeboat to be lowered. As you could well imagine, many people were learning that this was the last boat and they'd better get over there or else, and they were trying to rush to Collapsible D. The man doing the shooting was only 4 feet away from little Frankie, firing a pistol straight at the sky. As a warning, not one of them jumped into our boat. Had they done so, Collapsible D would have split in the middle, and we all would have been dumped into the water.
And the captain looked over the side from the bridge and sung out and told me to go round to the starboard side, to the gangway doors, which was practically the opposite side to where I was lowered. I had great difficulty in getting the boat round there. There was suction. I was using the stroke oar, standing up, and there was a lady helping. She was steering the boat round the ship's stern. When I passed round the boat, to try and get to this gangway door on the starboard side, her propellers were out of water. I'm not certain if I didn't pass underneath them. When I did eventually reach there, I found that there was such a mob standing in the gangway doors. Really, I daren't go alongside, because if they'd jumped, they would have swamped the boat. She was only a small boat.
Then the third-class passengers were coming up. There were 700 of them, and they swarmed the decks and filled up the decks. And I thought, well, I'd done all I possibly could. I'd helped them all I could. And I thought, well, now I'll go up and get out of all this scrumming and go on the poop deck. And she was sinking fast then.
The thing that ripped away from me instantly all sense of the beauty of the night, the beauty of the ship's lines, and the beauty of her lights. And that thing was the The awful angle made by the level of the sea with the rows of portholes along her side. The sea level and the rows of lights should have been parallel, should never have met. There was nothing else to indicate that she was injured, nothing but this apparent violation of a simple geometrical law, that the parallel lines should never meet, even if produced ever so far both ways. But her forward portholes were now below the level of the sea, and the after ones much higher above.
It was going down a little, just slowly, not fast at all. A very dark black night, and that boat was just beautiful. All the lights in the boat were on, but it was going down quietly, and the lights were going under the water as it went down, and a terrible sight.
The ship stood there fully lighted, absolutely lighted, music playing. We heard that in the lifeboat. We still saw the lighted ship alongside. In our lifeboat, we had 3 sets of oars, perfectly useless. The ocean was just as flat, well, as your bathtub. I never saw a lake quite that flat. Inky black night, starlit, and not a ripple in the sea. And the kind of cold, well, if you want to know what kind of cold it is, just open your Frigidaire door, take a seat inside and shut the door. And there I was, with nothing on practically, silk stockings, no underwear, no nothing, just about freezing to death.
Finally, the boat reached the water, and we had 1 man rowing an oar and 3 ladies rowing the other, because it only had 4 oars. And so they rowed fiercely for the rear of the ship, and they were on the port side, of course, and they circled around behind it and headed away from it on the starboard side, and then shortly stopped, as naturally as you could understand. And all the women, of course, were staring quickly back. And by that time, little Frankie wasn't very happy either, because a lot of those ladies had been crying, and I had began to worry a bit about my dad.
And I was on the starboard side, on the north side of the ship, all alone. I couldn't see a boat anywhere. That is when I burnt the green light to try and attract the other boats, but I never found them.
So we were really on the poop deck or on the main deck. There was a door up the stairs to the upper decks, you see. They locked that. I saw a woman that she had 2 small children, and they were hanging on to her skirt. And there was a fellow on the top deck. He said, "Just be quiet." He said, "There is another ship coming." Well, I could see the light of it myself. All the boats was going there and looking at the people. And that's the moments that I can never forget. Oh, hundreds and hundreds, you see, and they joined together, man. They kind of kept away from the railing, but they were standing together, you expect, and they joined hands, man, and they are hollering in different languages, "Save us, save us, save us." That is a picture I can never forget as long as I live.
We rowed away from the Titanic just as fast as we could, and there were 5 or 6 decks, and they were just lined with people standing there at the edge looking over. I suppose they were wishing and hoping someone would come and rescue them.
There wasn't any panic until the lifeboats left, and then there was panic galore. We were down on the ocean. We could hear them running about on the decks and screaming. You can imagine people came out from their cabin, went onto the deck, no lifeboat, tearing around the other side. That's when the panic was there. There wasn't any panic at the time I got in the lifeboat because there weren't enough people up there.
Then came the very last boat of all, and it was a sort of raft with collapsible canvas sides, stowed upside down on top of the officers' quarters.
He was assigned to a lifeboat number 13.
he was told to go and get the women and children in his care, get them to the lifeboats. So off he went down to get them. By the time he got back up on deck, having got all the people up, the lifeboats had gone. By this time, he said the water was coming up the companionway, and he was up on one of the higher decks. So at that point, could see some crew members. There was a collapsible lifeboat lashed to the side of the boat. They were trying to undo it. They said, "We need a knife. Anybody got a knife?" So my father shouted, "I have," passed his penknife up. They cut it free, and as it fell upside down. Water on the deck, it just floated, went straight over the rail, and out. That was it, lost.
A seaman named Hemming, he'd been with me in many of the mail boats. He and I cut this one adrift and threw it down on the water, which was now about 2 feet above the boat deck. So both of us went over to the starboard side. But we found all the boats were away from there too. Of course, there were still hundreds of people around.
We saw these people, these 15 or 1,700 people jumping from the decks and screaming and yelling for help, and we couldn't help them.
As Hemming and I looked down from the top of the officers' quarters, where we were standing, the ship took a sudden dip, and a sea came rolling up, carrying everyone with it. Many were drowned there and then. Everyone that could just instinctively started to scramble up towards the after end of the ship.
One of the crew members said to my father, "Jump, lad, you've got nothing left here for you, just jump." And he said it took a lot of determination for him to actually jump into the icy water where it was pitch black and leave the lights of the boat. Although the boat was sinking, there was comfort in the light rather than going to the pitch black, but he just jumped and he swam. He said he kept swimming, not knowing what direction, but he knew he had to get away from the suction of the boat. As he swam, he saw other people. He saw one man. He said to him, "Swim away from the suction." But the man didn't move, so he didn't know if he didn't understand English or if he was too cold to swim. He didn't know. But my father kept swimming. This object loomed in the darkness.
All of a sudden, she lifted up quickly, and you could hear everything crashing through her. Everything that was movable was going through her. And then she went down and seemed to come up again. So I thought, well, now I'm going to leave. And I was hanging on to a board. We had 2 boards, starboard and port, which said, "Keep clear of propeller blades." And I was hanging on to one of these, and I was getting higher and higher in the air. And I thought, well, now I'll go. And I dropped in. I had a lifebelt on. And I hit the water with a terrific crack. And luckily, I didn't hit anything when I dropped in. There were bodies all over the place. And then I looked up at the Titanic. So the propellers were right out of water, the rudder was right out, and I could see the bottom.
For my part, I turned forward and took a header from the top of the wheelhouse. I started to swim away, but got sucked down 2 or 3 times. In fact, I got mighty near the edge of things before I finally came up alongside the collapsible. We'd hove into the water from the top of the officers' quarters, and there I hung on.
And it was the upturned lifeboat that his knife had cut free. By that time, there were about 24 people on the underside of it, and there was just a slope, and he was able to scramble on there. There was really no room for anybody else. He was more or less the last managed to get on it.
A bit later, the forward funnel guys carried away, and the funnel, weighing perhaps 50 or 60 tons, fell down with a crash on the water. It missed the raft, some of us hanging onto it, by inches. But there were a good many it didn't miss.
Well, I saw the forward part of the boat deck dip underwater, so I jumped overboard. Swimming away from the ship, turned around to look at her, but down came the funnel and smashed into the water right in front of my face. I got a gush of wind and dirt through that nearly blinded me, and I felt the cap go off my head and one slipper off my foot. But it didn't take my attention off of this boat, and I see the collapsible boat washed straight over off the deck, within a few yards of me. But I managed to get onto it, and I was followed quickly by the second officer and a few others.
I had a fur-lined coat, And I took that off, and I took a pair of gloves out of there and stuck it in my pocket and threw it back on the deck. And then I took a hold of this rope and let myself down. I don't know how far, but I had let me down a ways, and then I let go. And I went down into the water, of course, and I went under, and I could feel a rope around me. I had probably some of this here, part of the rope, you see. Tried to get away from that as much as I could. Then I tried to swim, you see, away from the ship because I was afraid of it, the suction, but there wasn't much suction. If it had went down fast and flat, you see, the way that had been suction at least for a half a mile, you know. But I probably wasn't 100 yards away from it when it went down. You see, there was still a lot of people in the water there, you know. I tried to swim and get away from the boat, which I did. And at the last I saw the Titanic, there was still light when I was in the water looking at it, and the propellers, I could see them way out of more than half of the ship was on the water.
Next thing I remember, I was still hanging on to a bit of rope attached to the raft, but some 30 or 40 yards away from the ship. The wash of the falling funnel had evidently picked us up, raft and all, and flung us clear of the ship altogether. Several of us scrambled up onto the slippery bottom of the raft, and it was from there I saw the Titanic sink. As I watched, I could see her bow getting deeper and deeper in the water, with the foremast sticking up above the surface, whilst her stern lifted higher and higher, till it was right out of the water.
As she swung up, her lights went out suddenly, came on again for a single flash, and then went out altogether.
When she got to an angle of about 60 degrees, there was a sullen sort of rumbling roar.
Partly a groan, partly a rattle, partly a roar for some 15 to 20 seconds. I imagined it must have been the sound of heavy machinery breaking from fastenings and plunging down towards the sunken bows, smashing everything in its path. It was a noise I would never wish to hear again. It seemed to signify the end of everything.
When the ship broke in half, of course it broke in half between the four funnels. The stern stayed up for about a minute or so, and then it went down.
And I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink. And I saw that ship break in half. And for so many years, people have argued with me about that. But now at last, it has been proven beyond all doubt that she did break in half. I know she did. I saw her.
My great-grandma kept his face to her breast, effectively blinding him to what was going on. He could still hear. We know the ship broke in half. At one time, the ship was up close to being straight up and down. But they saw her sailing back. So they thought that she was going to float. And I'm thinking that this is when she broke in half. Because there was a loud thunderous crash. And then the stern came back, almost back to where she would have been normally. At that time, my great-grandmother let go of my grandfather, and he was able to see.
Up to that moment, she had stood out as clear with her rows of electric lights all burning. When the boilers broke away, she was, of course, plunged into absolute darkness, though her huge black outline was still perfectly distinct up against the stars and sky. Slowly, she reared up on end, till at last she was absolutely perpendicular.
When the noise was over, the Titanic was still upright, and she remained so for perhaps 5 minutes. And then, first sinking back a little at the stern, I thought, she slid slowly forward through the water and dived slantingly down. The sea closed over her, and we'd seen the last of the beautiful ship we had boarded 4 days before at Southampton.
We rode away just as far fast as we could because these people were screaming and yelling, and they They wanted to get into our boat. We had about 65 or 70 in our boat. We couldn't take any more. That was a terrible, terrible time when I can still hear them.
And we heard the dreadful sound of people drowning, which was, unbelievable.
Realised that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything. And the screams went on for some considerable time.
The cry of many hundreds of our fellow passengers struggling in the icy water. A cry that called to the heavens for the very injustice of its own existence. We were utterly surprised to hear this cry go up. We had heard no sound of any kind, and did not know then that the whole ship's company had not been accommodated in lifeboats. So the cries of the drowning filled us with horror and stupefaction. We longed to return and rescue at least some of them, but we knew it was impossible. Our boat was filled to standing room, and to return would have meant the swamping of us all. And so the captain stoker told his crew to row away from the cries. We tried to sing to keep all from thinking of them, but there was no heart for it. And the cries, which were loud and numerous at first, died away gradually, and I think the last of them must have been heard some 40 minutes after the Titanic went down.
It's so cold, boy, I could feel my hands getting cold. There was no human being that could stand that for any length of time, you know that. There wasn't, probably some there hung down to something, you see, for about an hour. That's the longest. You couldn't hear nothing after.
I didn't want to die, and I didn't see much chance of living, but I was gradually getting frozen up. And by the grace of God, I came across a lifeboat, and they pulled me in. And there was a fireman dead in the bottom, and there was about a foot of water in this boat. There was another man who he seemed to be trying to get away from it again. I don't know what was the matter with him. They were tying him down. And the rest were women and children. And I sat on a seat, and I sat next to Mrs. Clark, the girl I'd put into a lifeboat. And she said, the first thing she said, have you seen my husband? So I said, no, I haven't, but I expect he'll be all right. Anyway, I was in a pretty bad way then, as you can imagine, frozen solid almost. And she wrapped me round with a cloak. She had some sort of blanket or a coat on. Anyway, I think she probably saved my life, I don't know. But I saved hers. At least I think I might have done. I think I did. And she saved mine.
Because our lifeboat was so full, so overfull, the officers called all the boats together and transshipped some of us. One in that boat and two in that and three in that, and I got separated from my mother. And that was the most terrifying thing to happen to a child.
The children were crying and whimpering. It suddenly struck me, I believe I'll play music, and then the little children maybe will be diverted and amused. And there I sat, and all night long I played them at cheech. And the poor little children were so interested in the music box that most of them stopped crying.
During the night, he said there were screams that he never forgot. And also he said that there were people on the boat, sort of grumbling, but they all said, we must pray. So they started praying. He said they all prayed different languages, but all with the same meaning.
Many died from cold during the night, the wireless operator amongst them. And a mighty long time it seemed before daylight broke, standing wet through and up to our knees in icy water on that upturned boat. Frankly, I don't think many of us expected to see daylight.
At one time he said he desperately wanted to go to sleep, and he said,
I must go to sleep. And someone said, if you sleep now, it'll be your last. So they were kept awake. They all sort of helped each other.
When daylight did break, most of us were still heads up, and we of the upturned boat transferred to one of the lifeboats.
Eventually, we saw a rocket go up, and it turned out to be the Carpathia. So she'd seen my green light that I had burnt. So I burnt another one, and eventually she steered for the position that I was in. And consequently, I was the first boat picked up. People on the Carpathia told me that it was about just before 4 o'clock, about 5 minutes to 4, I think. I got alongside there, everything was ready, derricks was hoisted, derrick falls and bowlines in them, and there was ladders over the side. Absolutely everything had been done that was possible to be done. And the captain kept sending down to know if there was an officer in the boat and send him up at once. But I sent a message back, when I get the boat empty, then I'll come up. I've only got one sailor in the boat. And eventually the boat emptied, and then I went up to the Captain Rostron on the bridge. And he said, where's the ship? I said, she's sunk. And I said, I don't know where the other boats are. I've not seen any of them.
About an hour after we had been in this lifeboat, I fell asleep. And then it seemed, of course, only a few minutes. It wasn't, of course. It was a couple of hours or so. I quickly awakened because the lifeboat had begun to rock. Because the water we had been in was very, very calm, except for the normal tide rise and fall. And I opened my eyes, and the sun was out, and there were lots of lifeboats around us, and the rescue vessel was just off in the distance a short way, and we were rowing towards it. Our boat, the passengers on our lifeboat, were taken aboard the rescue vessel at 7:30 in the morning.
And the rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. She was quite a small vessel, Carpathia, but she looked big from there. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened I don't know whether the word is right, a hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid. They threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart. It's quite a big mesh. Children would have slipped through it, small children. Anyway, our legs and feet would have gone through it. So each child was put in a sack. And I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack, and it was tied around, and the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard. But that really was quite terrifying. Then having got on board, of course, I couldn't find my mother. And I didn't find her for hours.
We finally got to the Carpathia. They let down a swing for me to get into it. Well, I was so cold that I was numb with the cold, and I couldn't hold on at all. So they tied me in the swing and pulled me up to the top.
I boarded the Carpathia around about 8 o'clock. They put us on little wooden planks.
They had the blankets piled to the ceiling. It had brandy and hot coffee to warm us up. And they had an officer there to meet each one of us.
Mother and I and a lot of other ladies and young kids were put in the second-class salon where they had arranged for us to sleep and stay until we reached New York.
A lady came up to me and she says, "Is your name Ruth Becker?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And she said, well, your mother has been looking every place for you. So I was reunited with my mother and my brother and my sister, and they were all right.
Several crewmen came, and they called out to the group of women, was there anything they could do for us? And Mother spoke up instantly and said, yes, there is. Can you please bring us needles and thread and cloth and scissors or anything like that, because we have to make some clothing for some of these ladies and these young children.
When the men put their wives into the lifeboats on the Titanic, they said, well, we will meet you when we're saved by another boat. We will meet you there. So on the Carpathia, the women were all standing at the rail watching for their husbands to come in later boats. And they never came.
Little Frankie's face was wet frequently during the day because Dad and I had been very, very close friends. And he'd done an awful lot for me in many hundreds of ways that I can't forget.
At 12 o'clock noon, we started for New York. Now, this is one of the things that stands out in my mind. You can imagine what it was with these women who knew then that their husbands had gone down the ship.
That same afternoon, another group of men came to ask if there was anything they could do. And Mother spoke up at once because she was in charge of this group that was doing the work in there. Yes, if you will, we'd like to have you take care of these young girls and boys, if you can. So one man took me under his wing, and his name was Sam Collins. He had been a stoker and led me around, and every once in a while he'd look down and see me with these tears. He'd say to me, Frankie, don't worry. He says, your daddy is probably on another rescue vessel and may get to New York even before we do. After a while I began to think that was true, and so then I began to lose my fear. And he took me all over the ship, up on the captain's bridge, down into the hold, all over, and took very, very good care of me.
Nobody was allowed to get off the ship unless they had friends, good friends or relatives in New York meeting them there. My father was in India, and a very good friend of ours cabled my father and said, all Beckers saved. Well, my father didn't know what we were saved from, but he figured we were saved from a train wreck.
My mother's first words were when she landed, how soon can I go home? We came straight back here.
Reporters came out of the walls. I mean, they must have taken some boats out there and gotten on the Carpathia. And Mother was so nervous that she cried all the time. I mean, when anybody asked her, she cried. And she'd say, don't ask me any questions, ask Ruth, and she'll tell you.
I believe you've even got a watch that you were wearing at the time when you went into the water.
Yes. Oh, but and it's only an old gunmetal watch. But I couldn't afford anything better in those early days. Here it is. This one.
What does it show us? That says 2:20. What time was it when you went into the water, do you think?
I think about 2 o'clock. I think it lasted. It was frozen up like I was. I think it lasted for about 20 minutes in the water.
Does talking about this incident bother you like you have been today?
Talking about it? I should probably dream of that tonight. Have another nightmare. You'd think I'm too old for that, but you'd be amazed. You lie in bed at night and the whole thing comes round again.
My grandfather, living in Detroit later, wouldn't go to sports shows because when you hit a home run, people start screaming, and he related it directly to the sinking of the Titanic.
After the Titanic, on the same White Star Line, I was on the Majestic when she broke in half, and I was on the Olympic when she struck a tidal wave. As a matter of fact, a great many of the captains sort of avoided me. I often wonder if the Titanic could have escaped me. I really believe sometimes I sunk the Titanic.
And as I say, all these years later, this interest is profound. And it's because there was no need for anyone to die. No one should have died. Had she had enough lifeboats with 2.5 hours and a very smooth sea, nobody would have died. And one life is worth more than the whole ship, surely. That is what I saw, that is what I remember.